Sly Cooper is a series that full stop will never get the respect it deserves. When it first released, it was treated to decent sales, but sort of held at arm's length, a third wheel to its spiritual older brothers Jack and Ratchet, despite actually coming out before Ratchet. It was predominantly in hindsight that fans and media began lumping Sly into this holy trinity of PlayStation 2 platformers, but even still, it sat in the back seat. And yet, the Cooper gang, pound for pound, might just have the strongest PS2 trilogy of the three. It's a series that brought real stakes to each game, and built those stakes not just from the serialized episodic chapters of each Sly game, but also from game to game, rewarding players that kept coming back by building a world far grander than all of the larger-than-life characters and the open-world hub areas combined. And it's a franchise whose DNA is oh so clearly weaved into every Sucker Punch project since, and really into the DNA of the studio itself. Sly Cooper is also the very first game I reviewed on this channel back in 2016. In fact, I redid that first video and covered the entire franchise already a few years ago, back when I still gave review scores. And although the series currently lays dormant, with constant questionable rumors of a new game and a movie-turned-cartoon that's supposedly finished and still somehow missed its October 2019 release date by over 2 years now, thanks to some freshly unearthed info, there is a bit more that I can add to the legacy of Sly Cooper. So I've remastered these videos with that new insight in this director's supercut, the ultimate video covering the entire series. Probably not, but it sounds nice. Please subscribe, I need this. Without further ado, this is the Sly Cooper franchise. Although the first Sly game released in 2002, our raccoon hero's journey properly begins back in 1997. Sucker Punch Productions was first founded by a group of friends that left Microsoft to pursue a career in game development, wanting to work in a smaller, tightly knit crew rather than one of the biggest companies in the world. Despite having almost zero collective game development experience, Sucker Punch decided on making a cute 3D platformer for the N64, citing the limited competition since the N64 only had a handful of games coming out per year. Released as Rocket Robot on Wheels in 1999, this gem of a game is not only commonly cited as the first console game ever to use a proper physics engine, a game, remember, made by non-developers, it also featured an evil raccoon villain that served as an early inspiration for the studio's next protagonist. Now, not knowing how to pitch a game, how to get a development kit from Nintendo to begin with, just having no clue how the industry worked, the team bankrolled most of this game's production themselves, and started pitching an almost finished game in 1998 to every publisher that would listen, including Sony. Yes, they pitched a Nintendo 64 game to the PlayStation folks. Hey, it wasn't unheard of. There's a Wipeout game on N64 developed by a Sony-owned studio, and that is a Sony-owned franchise. PlayStation execs did like the project, but politely turned them down due to the whole N64 thing. I'll talk more about that game some other time, because it's a really cool one. The important thing for now is that Sucker Punch learned the ropes with Rocket's development. They learned to partner up with a publisher right away instead of later on, which they did with Sony shortly after this game released, and they learned exactly what kind of game they wanted to make. So they narrowed it down and focused on a more linear game idea, and they followed the idea of a raccoon thief as the hero, just only because they liked the idea of a raccoon putting on a face mask over his little mask face. How could you not love these folks already? This is, of course, 2002's Sly Cooper and the Thievius Raccoonus. Sly Cooper is the latest child born into a long line of master thieves. The Cooper clan was world-renowned for pulling some of history's greatest heists, mainly stealing from those who abused their wealth. Each Cooper journaled his or her skills into a book for future generations to learn from and improve upon, the Thievius Raccoonus. However, a couple millennia of stealing from high-profile thieves made the Cooper clan a target. I'm not sure how, because raccoons are adorable. I mean, look at that face. Could you really get mad at that face? They're so cute. Well, apparently a gang known as the Fiendish Five found a way, because they really hated the Coopers. Led by the mysterious gigantic owl Clockwork, this group broke into the Cooper house and stole the Thievius Raccoonus. Wait, how did they even get through the door? Clockwork's got a wingspan of like 50 feet. Well, however they did it, they killed Sly's parents once inside, leaving the young Cooper cowering in a closet. With no family left to care for him, Sly was sent to an orphanage where he met his best friends Bentley and Murray. Together, the trio began a long journey to reclaim the book and save the Cooper family's history. This is where Sly 1 begins. The gang starts off in Paris, where they're stealing Sly's case file from the office of Carmelita Fox, one of Interpol's finest. Once they've made off with the file, they find that the Fiendish Five split the book up amongst themselves and spread across the world. With that, the gang hunts down each member of the Fiendish Five, defeats them, retrieves their section of the Thievius Raccoonus, and gets out just before Carmelita crashes the joint. There's Raleigh, the genius frog engineer, Mugshot, the roided-up mobster bulldog, Ms. Ruby, the voodoo savant alligator, the revenge-hungry demolitions expert known as the Panda King, and finally, Clockwork. What's interesting about these villains is that after stealing the book, they all went on their separate paths. There was no overarching goal at hand here except to kill off the Cooper lineage. I find that uniquely intriguing for a group of antagonists, especially for a kid's game. As we'll see going forward with this series, Sly's never afraid to get a little dark and a little real. After working their way across the world and through the first 4 members of the Fiendish Five, Sly and the gang find Clockwork's lair in Russia. Naturally, they head in, fighting past multiple security measures.
That's no tower!
That's no moon.
It's a giant death ray!
With Sly even saving a trapped Carmelita. The two form a temporary alliance to take Clockwork down once and for all. During the climactic final battle, Sly learns his foe's backstory. Clockwork at one point thousands of years ago was slighted by one of the Coopers, and has held a grudge against the clan ever since. He's gone as far as to replace his entire body with mechanical parts to become immortal, living entirely on his hatred. He founded the Fiendish Five in order to execute his master plan, stealing the Thievius Raccoonus to prove that he, not the Coopers, was the world's greatest thief. He even kept Sly alive to show that without the book, the Coopers were nothing. It's actually a brilliant plan, and it explains why the Fiendish Five split the book up in the first place. Of course, that's the only part of his brilliant plan, because after that he just kind of flaps around for a bit while Sly shoots at him. You didn't think that went through all the way, did you, buddy? He's probably still concussed from hitting his head on that door frame all those years ago. Either way, Sly takes Clockwork down once and for all, at which point Carmelita ends their alliance, giving Sly a 10-second head start to escape.
5, 4, 3, 2...
The gang runs off with the now completed Thievius Raccoonus, and that closes our adventure. I love the story in this game. Within each hub, almost every mission builds the plot more and more, talks up the villains, and makes the world feel more genuine. Sly lives up to his name, always being calm and collected in the field. Not to mention he's always especially suave around Carmelita. Bentley is neurotic and constantly warning Sly about possible dangers, but he always finds a way to help his buddy out with intel. Murray, well, I'll be honest, I'm not a big fan of how they treat Murray in this game. All he is a big, stupid teddy bear, or hippo, I guess. Everything involving Murray shows that he's dumb and that his love for food gets him into trouble. He just feels flat in Sly 1, a characteristic I'm glad they fix in the sequels. That's really the only significant gripe I have here though. Sly 1, like the rest of the series, feels like a thoughtfully executed plot that never particularly drags, jumping from episode to episode as if it was an actual cartoon. What's that? There's actually a cartoon now? Sly 1's story absolutely earns a golden bolt here. The way I often like to describe the first Sly game is that it's the logical next step in the Crash Bandicoot franchise, with added stealth mechanics. Similar to Crash, it's a level-based 3D platformer with relatively linear level design. Also like Crash, Sly has very limited health here and uses charms as extra hits. Some of the set pieces just come off in a very similar style too. Maybe it's just me, but the more I look at it, the more I see our raccoon hero as a PS2 update of everybody's favorite Bandicoot. Not everything is one-to-one, of course. For example, in addition to the basic X to jump and square to attack that Crash and Sly both share, triangle is used for special thief moves that Sly acquires throughout the game. Circle, meanwhile, is the do everything button. Seriously, if you're ever not sure how to do something in Sly, just jump and press the circle button, I promise. Additionally, whereas Crash always had a bit of weight to him, Sly is actually pretty floaty, in order to give both the players and the game a chance to breathe with those contextual circle button moves. This floatiness works in the game's favor as Sly controls incredibly well. His motions are fluid, especially for a PS2 game, his attacks feel powerful, and despite risking the entire game on an action button, Sucker Punch made sure that the platforming rarely messes up on you. The big moment where Sly splits off from our orange buddy is, like I mentioned earlier, a focus on stealth. Sneaking around is always optional though, so advanced players can just cheese past most of the obstacles. These advanced players are even rewarded in the post-game when every level receives a time trial challenge. Sound familiar? However, even the most experienced players have gotta be careful because one hit and you're dead. If you collect enough coins throughout the levels from breaking and killing things, like any good thief, you'll obtain a lucky horseshoe to give you an extra hit, and it even stacks up for up to 2 freebie hits. Not that it really matters, lives are plentiful and there's no real punishment if you do game over. Even if you die in a level more than 2 or 3 times, the game pities you with a gimme horseshoe. On paper this all sounds simple, and maybe even a bit weak. This might have cut it on the PS1, but we're in the next generation now. Things need to be bigger and better. Well, thankfully, Sly 1 thrives on its level design. Missions are incredibly varied and always add something new to the formula. Be it a level where you sneak by guards in a barrel to one of the many showdowns with Carmelita. Without interesting levels and set pieces to challenge the player, the formula of Sly Cooper would have fallen apart immediately. Thankfully, Sucker Punch realized this and they iterate constantly. Moreover, to add even more depth to the experience, in every level there are a set number of hidden clue bottles. Collect all of them and you get a code for that level's safe, which holds a page of the Thievius Raccoonus. The power-ups on these pages are entirely supplementary, such as a dive roll or this mid-air slow motion power-up. Later on, there are some really useful ones, such as total invisibility, but they're really just cool incentives to search each level. Like I said, this game absolutely shines as a platformer. The key problem with Sly 1 is that it doesn't want to be a platformer a lot of the time. Of the 40 levels in the game, about a third are non-Sly levels. Those levels consist of either Murray racing in the car because he's hungry, Murray being defended by Sly as he runs towards a key, or some other random mission like killing crabs to defend your treasure? These missions as a whole just suck. There's no genuine difficulty to these missions either. It's mostly about brute memorization of the level layout, spending a few tries getting a grip on controls that are about as tight as a broken rubber band, or just plain luck. It's a shame because these missions kill Sly 1's pace. Raleigh's stage is a fantastic tutorial for the game, teaching the player mechanics consistently from level to level. From World 2 onward, 2 or 3 of the stage's 7 missions are gimmicks. Pretty much the entire final world is just one gimmick mission after another, and even Ms. Ruby's boss fight in World 3 is just friggin' DDR, except the timing on the button presses is slightly off. Now, to give credit where it's due, sometimes there is a funny reason for these filler missions. Such as this one, where we have to hack into Clockwork's Death Ray. We have to run over exactly 60 falling computers in order to hack into the system, but these lava slugs here like to eat computers too, so we have to race them. Why do we have to race, you might be asking? Are there only 119 computers?
There are only 119 computers up there!
When the game does something right, man, does it do it right. There are levels that get my blood pumping, levels that make me feel like I, myself, am a master thief. And then there are levels that make me wonder what I'm doing with my time. Now given, it's not like I'm wasting a ton of time on Sly 1 because the game can be beaten pretty easily in an afternoon or less. This adventure lives and dies on the Sly sections. It didn't want to commit to being just a platformer, even though it would have been a fantastic platformer. Instead, it's just a good platformer, one that's held back by the developer's desire for variety. Because the gameplay could have, and arguably should have, been so much more with so much less, I'm going to give the gameplay for Sly 1 a bronze bolt. While the game often falters on its substance, it makes up for that with loads of style. Upon starting Sly 1, we're treated to a cutscene of our main character preparing to break into Carmelita's office. The game actually overlays the main menu on top of real-time footage of Sly trotting around on the Interpol station's roof. If you're starting a new file, you'll jump into the action right here. They ham it up right away too, showing opening credits on the screen to highlight the stars of the game as you proceed through this intro. Again, Sly has always had that Saturday morning cartoon vibe to it. Like a weekend cartoon, the voice acting can get a bit rough at times. For example, Carmelita isn't exactly a show-stopping performance. I can promise you're gonna hear that one again before this marathon's through. Overall, it's fairly solid, especially for 2002. In particular, Kevin Miller's delivery as Sly is always a highlight in my eyes. He's honestly the heart of the series for me. There's good humor in the dialogue too, and the game never takes itself too seriously. Yeah, I might hate the janky vehicle controls, but Murray accidentally winning a race because he saw a food stand nearby? That's funny enough for me to give it a pass sometimes. Visually, the game is a beauty. Each chapter is bookended with comic-style cutscenes that give some backstory on the boss and forward the plot. Sucker Punch does a superb job of building the world in a short time with just these scenes. When it comes to the in-game models, the animation is always fluid, and hitting enemies has the most satisfying thump to it. Sly always feels like a thief too, with his low center of gravity and the lightness of his movement. Levels rarely seem to repeat themselves visually too, even the ones that appear in the same overworld. Everything is always clearly laid out, and the world looks bright even though the colors themselves are dark. You might run into a couple graphical quirks here or there, but they never take away from the experience. Whether you play it on PS2 or PS3, it's genuinely a looker. Completing the package, it sounds great too. When Sly sneaks up behind an enemy, a little Tom and Jerry sort of bass flourish plays to match his footsteps. Most tracks have a jazzy groove to them to make you feel like a thief, while also making you feel vulnerable as a young, inexperienced thief. Take Prowling the Grounds for example. It's one of the first tracks you hear, and it sets the tone so well. The track hides several layers behind the groove, trying to make the player feel nervous and weak at any given point. Deep in the background, there's constantly white noise playing to simulate the rain from Raleigh's weather machine. The frequent drip, drip, drip of raindrops keeps the player wondering if that sound might just be somebody turning around to discover them. Foliage seems to crackle as if there's something waiting to strike. It is so impressive to me that such a wonderful atmosphere is built up here in the first world without a single word. All of this atmosphere comes with a trade-off though, and that's that the soundtrack is mostly a complementary piece to the gameplay and thus doesn't stand out too much on its own. The levels in Mugshot's Mesa City Casino make you feel like you're gambling, and you get genuinely uneasy when trekking through Hades' swamp because of the deep, booming undertones. But it's hard to throw too many of these tracks on without context and enjoy them by themselves. That said, this is certainly the kind of game where the soundtrack could very easily blend together under a lesser composer, but each area sounds unique, and that helps each area feel unique. That's really all you can ask for with this kind of soundtrack. I think the coolest thing in terms of presentation though comes after you do everything else. In an addition almost entirely unique to this game, after 100%ing Sly 1, each level has a developer commentary that you can optionally play. In these, members of the development team discuss design choices for the level, things that were cut during development of said level, or even something entirely different. This feature is incredibly cool and adds to the experience for those that want to know every little secret about the game. Sly 1 has just about everything you could want out of a game as far as presentation goes. I do wish the soundtrack was a tad bit more memorable at times, but I can give that a pass. What I can't give a pass to is the often subpar delivery from certain characters in the game, such as Carmelita or even Clockwork for that matter. In a game with such strong character interaction, that just comes off as jarring, and that's enough for me to drop the game down to a Silverbolt for its presentation. When Sony picked up the pitch for Sly 1, the team at Sucker Punch had two goals in mind according to co-founder Brian Fleming: sell 500,000 copies and make a sequel. Thankfully, both of those goals came to pass, and you would think with how much Sly's been talked about over the years and how much it's been coveted by fans that this series would be full of runaway hits. However, the thing is, there's actually a bit of common confusion by fans regarding Sly, in that the games were never exactly flying off shelves. I think this goes back to Sly being put on that pedestal next to Jack and Ratchet, and indeed the comparisons that Sucker Punch itself was getting to Naughty Dog and Insomniac. We all assumed that they all sold well because we love them today, but the truth is that sales-wise, Sly's always kind of been in the shadows. Let me put this into perspective for you. According to internal sales data, Infamous Second Son, the really rushed, kind of bad one, outsold the entire Sly Cooper franchise. The numbers can differ a bit from game to game depending on which source you look at. Some third-party sources in the past had listed Sly 1 as eventually racking up over 2 million worldwide sales, but internal data provided by Sanzaru during Sly 4's original pitch indicated about 1.5 million lifetime sales. Either way, they're great numbers that don't tell the full story at the time. A year after Sly 1 released, it entered the greatest hits lineup in North America, so obviously it's gotta be a hit. That's a lot of sales really quick, except I hope you already know this, it's just kind of marketing. The requirements for a PS2 greatest hit were that the game was 12 months old, so Sly got that one, and had shipped, not sold, 400,000 units in the US. Any games that fit that criteria could then be republished with the red label, usually at a $19.99 price point, to encourage further sales and in turn hopefully encourage earlier and higher priced sales of, say, a sequel. And make no mistake, Sly 2 entered production pretty much immediately after the first game wrapped. Sucker Punch may have had a sales benchmark, but Sony saw enough already to know that they wanted more, and they knew just how to try and bolster those sales numbers to make that happen. It's a good strategy by Sony, especially when you consider that, they're the ones that have a significant hand in deciding how many copies of a game get produced to begin with, and thus they get to decide what consumers consider to be best sellers. And although this helps make it pretty clear that most of Sly 1's US sales came from the bargain bin, this far out, who the hell cares? That's more folks that got to buy the game and try it for cheap and then fell in love with the series. It's job security and more experience for the team at Sucker Punch, who nowadays are consistently outselling their earlier series in just one game and dropping Game of the Year contenders. It's a win for everybody. I just find a lot of this to be important context as to why Sly's passionate fanbase seems to go ignored. See, as far as I found, no Sly game ever received the Platinum Hits designation in Europe, their version of Greatest Hits, despite sales actually improving in the region game after game. Meanwhile, Sly 1 and 2 underperformed in Japan to such a degree that the third game never received a Japanese version until the HD collection on PS3. And yet, again, despite all this, Sony kept pushing its support in Sucker Punch, a small fledgling studio that they had no stake in yet. Sly received numerous marketing pushes in other games, via Toonami ads on Cartoon Network. This first game received awards for being one of 2002's best and most underrated titles, and this developer continued to, pardon the pun, punch above its weight limit. That's, in my opinion, why Sony greenlit a sequel so soon. Sometimes it's not about the sales, it's what you see, and what you see in Sucker Punch time and again is drive. Two years after the events of Sly 1, the gang's adventure this time begins at the Cairo Museum of Natural History, where the newest exhibit is a fully reconstructed clockwork. Knowing firsthand the danger that Clockwork's metal body could bring, Sly, Bentley, and Murray attempt to steal Clockwork's parts before somebody else can. However, when Sly gets to the exhibition room, he finds out that they're late to the party. The Clockwork parts had already been taken, and Carmelita had set a trap, hoping the thief would return to the scene of the crime. After Carmelita accuses Sly of the Clockwork heist, her new understudy Neela lets slip that the Claw Gang could be the ones that made off with the parts. Naturally, the Cooper Gang escapes the ensuing chase and starts studying up on the Claw Gang. If they've got the parts, they're definitely not using them for good. Sadly, it turns out that assumption's correct. The Claw Gang ain't no fiendish five. They don't just sit idly by on their victory after their heist is complete. Instead, each member pushes forward in several highly illegal endeavors, using the Clockwork parts to expedite the process. For example, Dimitri uses the Clockwork tail feathers to print counterfeit money at a breakneck pace, driving himself to fortune. Jean Bisson uses the Clockwork talons to deforest thousands of trees for his logging venture. And Rajan uses the Clockwork heart to make illegal psychedelic drugs. I'm not even exaggerating, his spice ring is quite literally just a drug ring with a slightly more PG name. Sly 2 isn't messing around. Don't forget, this game was rated E. The Cooper Gang isn't messing around either, and with the occasional help and tips provided by Constable Neela, piece by piece they take back the Clockwork parts. Step by step they take down each member of the Claw Gang, and bit by bit they uncover the secret behind the entire Claw Gang operation. One thing I love about Sly 2 is that these heists aren't always successful for Sly and the crew. More often than not, the game's episodes end without a decisive boss fight, and that member of the Claw Gang escapes to fight another day. This makes them feel so much more formidable than the one-and-done Fiendish Five of the original game. By the time you get to that boss fight, you've been dealing with a single villain for 2 or more hours. You've seen them develop, you've heard their strategies change. They become full-fledged characters rather than just obstacles. When it's not guaranteed that the Cooper gang wins, and you actually see them lose a couple times, it makes those victories feel that much more satisfying. After the gang takes down Dimitri and right near the end of their second attempt to take down Rajan, Neela betrays Sly, leading to him and Murray being captured by Interpol. She also frames Carmelita of helping the Cooper gang and gets her arrested. Despite having to fight off his fears and go solo in order to save his friends, Bentley learns that the Contessa, Carmelita's boss, is actually a member of the Claw gang and is working to brainwash Carmelita so that she takes the fall for the entire operation. Eventually, after saving Carmelita and putting the Contessa behind bars, the gang sneaks their way onto the airship of the Claw gang's leader, Arpeggio. Here they find that Clockwork has been fully reassembled. This is where it all comes together masterfully. We find out that this small bird has planned to place himself into Clockwork's body to become immortal, but he was missing a crucial piece of the puzzle: hate. So Arpeggio and his protege Neela created the Claw gang to generate that very hate. Rajan's spice opened up the minds of its users to hypnotism at the hands of the Contessa. All the Contessa needed for mass hypnotism was a huge amount of flashing light to aid in the process. So Jean Bisson had been chosen to siphon the light out of the Northern Lights. With all of the pieces in place, Arpeggio planned to fly his airship to Paris, where thousands had consumed massive quantities of Rajan's spice at Dimitri's club. Upon being hypnotized, the entire city would then go insane with enough hatred to fuel Clockwork's frame. And if you thought it ended there, you'd be wrong. At the very start of the game, Neela specifically tipped Sly off to the Claw gang's existence to get the ball rolling. Sly, Bentley, and Murray stole back every single Clockwork part one by one, leaving them all a sitting duck, or owl, for Neela and Arpeggio to steal all at once. The entirety of the game up until this point builds to this moment, this reveal that everything the Cooper gang had done was itself a setup. God, this is just perfect. Or it would be until what comes next. Neela double-crosses Arpeggio, gets into Clockwork's body herself, and becomes... Clockla. I kid you not, she calls herself Clockla. Don't get me wrong, it makes sense that after all of this, she would be our final boss, but man, after hearing that Arpeggio had set this entire plan in motion just to live in a stronger body, it feels weak to just write him off in an instant like that. And for what? So Neela can become immortal? We don't get any motivation here for this betrayal, and that lack of motivation is the sole weak point in an otherwise fantastic narrative. Obviously, Sly takes Clockla down, yet again defeating the owl with the help of Carmelita. Upon crash landing in Paris, Murray lifts Clockwork's mouth open so that Bentley can grab and destroy the hate chip once and for all. But Murray's not strong enough, and Bentley's spine is crushed under the weight of Clockwork's beak. No, seriously, he's paralyzed. I told you, this game isn't messing around. Murray's able to pry Clockwork open and grab the now motionless Bentley, and Carmelita destroys the hate chip. With that one motion, all of the Clockwork parts begin to wilt, as if the years had caught up to them all in one instant. But at what cost? Clockwork was right when he said that Sly would never be rid of him, and now every time that he looks at Bentley, he's going to see the pain that Clockwork caused to him and his family. Knowing that Bentley and Murray couldn't handle being arrested by Carmelita, Sly bargains with her and offers himself up for capture. Leaving their gear behind, Murray carries the limp Bentley away, and Sly shortly afterwards escapes the Interpol helicopter. This is where Sly 2 comes to a close. Band of Thieves takes a massive leap after the success of Sly 1, moving to tell a deeper, more detailed, and clearly darker story. We see the Cooper gang pushed to its limits several times. We see villains outrun and even outsmart our heroes. There is so much to unpack here, and even if I unpacked it all, I don't know that I would do it justice. The villains are even better than those from the first game, with Dimitri being a standout. His mannerisms, such as his dialogue being almost exclusively misinterpreted catchphrases and slang, led to him becoming a fan favorite that would make an appearance in every subsequent Sly game. The heroes are fleshed out significantly as well, with Bentley at points totally shining, and Murray actually getting a character. Instead of just eating and being dumb, now his strength is played up, and he acts like a superhero named the Murray. It's fantastic. This whole story is fantastic. Yes, it sort of limps a little bit near the end due to that one plot twist, but it's redeemed by the ending. Besides that single tripping point, Sly 2 tells a powerful tale from start to finish. I'm still shocked sometimes that this kind of story is told in a game made at least partly for children. It approaches mature subjects and treats them and the audience with respect, trusting that the kids could handle it. It's designed in such a way that it's perfect for all players no matter their age. I could keep on gushing, but it probably goes without saying we're looking at a golden bolt for Sly 2's story, easily. Get ready for some more gushing, because Sly 2 is about as good a second outing as you can ever have out of a video game. It's far grander in scale, it's far deeper mechanically, you know what, let me start from the beginning. Take everything you knew from the first game and throw it out the window. It's no longer a stealthy, linear, Crash Bandicoot style of gameplay we're working with. Instead, we've gone open world, and it's not just Sly in those worlds. For the first time, Bentley and Murray are full-on field agents. The game is called Band of Thieves after all. I'll get into those two in a little bit though. While Sly 1 was a tight platformer with light stealth elements to make the platforming more unique, 2 moves much deeper into that stealth mindset, while keeping the platforming and even adding beat-em-up action gameplay. Instead of being a one-hit KO, Sly and the gang have a health bar to encourage you to fight if you get caught. You can much more easily sneak up behind enemies. Hell, Sly can even pickpocket them with his cane. To encourage a stealthy approach, pickpocketing will always earn you more money than if you had killed the enemies in combat, and some enemies even have loot in their pockets that are worth even more money. On top of this, missions are more likely to require stealth because unlike Sly 1, the missions in Band of Thieves are all interconnected. The 8 overworlds of Sly 2 are each just as much of a character as the Cooper gang or their Claw gang targets. Despite being relatively small, they are densely packed with content. Guards are prowling the grounds and the rooftops ready for a chase or a fight. Every locale has one or multiple landmarks that make sure you always have your bearings. Sprinkled throughout the worlds are even expensive treasures that the gang can grab and run back to the safe house. Taking even a single hit will break those treasures though, so you have to be careful. Some of these are booby-trapped too, so you've got to get them back so Bentley can disarm them before you explode. Almost every inch of each overworld is used at some point before you move on to the next area. And then, of course, there's the main goodies that we already know and love, the clue bottles. Rather than having multiple sets of bottles for every mission, the overworlds each have 30 bottles, and they generally provide a much more useful ability when gathered. The first game's power-ups were nice, but often they were tied to specific playstyles. In Band of Thieves, there are still a few situational powers, but you're probably going to find yourself using a bunch of them. Namely because Sly 2 allows you to hotkey up to 3 gadgets on the L1, L2, and R2 buttons per character. Having a combat dodge to easily slide by attacks when you're swarmed by enemies is insanely useful, or dropping a smoke bomb to make a hasty escape, or throwing an alarm clock to distract enemies so that you can sneak right by without getting into an altercation entirely. It's all wonderful. There are also a couple secret gadgets only unlocked via cheat code, like this one that lets you throw a miniature Tom from Toonami to draw the attention of enemies.
You're gonna kill my dick? Well, I'll kill your dick! Only Toonami.
My favorite though is the stealth slide. I don't know why, I just love sliding through the levels without making a peep. It's so much more satisfying than sprinting by pressing R1 and drawing the enemy's attention. Bentley and Murray each have their own sets of gadgets as well, which I'll get into a little bit later. Now you might be asking where all these powers are going to come from if there are only 8 sets of clue bottles compared to the dozens of the first game. That brings me back to that loot, those treasures, and those coins. Sly 2 introduces ThiefNet, an online black market where the gang can sell their stolen goods and buy new gadgets. Yet again, many of these are optional, but you'll still find yourself hooked regardless, pickpocketing whenever you can, smashing everything around you for extra coins, and scouring the overworlds for treasure. All the while, you're learning the world more, you're attaching yourself to the locales, and you're creating moments that'll come back to you whenever you replay the game. So many games have a lifeless open world, and it's one of the biggest sins in gaming when it happens. Sly 2 absolutely never has that problem for me. Part of that is because many of the game's missions take place right in the overworld, rather than being in their own levels. You'll follow the Claw Gang members around their respective hub worlds for varying reasons. You'll track guard patterns. You'll plant a bug in their base to hear their communications. Sometimes it's even an actual bug. That's not to say that every mission takes place outside though, there are several interior missions too, and each of them have their own layouts. For example, you'll ransack the inside of Rajan's guest house, putting together a suit for Sly to wear. With a few exceptions, all of the game's missions are incredibly fun. The exterior ones do a great job of further helping these worlds stick out in your minds, while the interiors are wonderful for changing up the pace. No matter what, they often show that Sucker Punch was really ahead of their time on this one. Many people have said it before, but Sly 2 can be seen as a predecessor to the Assassin's Creed games, except designed for kids. There are a series of high-octane missions on a moving train that predated Uncharted 2's big train set piece by half a decade. I'm not saying Sly directly inspired either of those two things, of course, it's just interesting to note. Although, Sly and Nathan Drake are rivals in PlayStation All-Stars. Maybe they're arguing about who can destroy more trains. The missions play another key part in this whole equation too, and that's where I get to bring in Bentley and Murray. Each member of the Cooper gang will have his own task during each heist, and each of these missions plays into the character's strengths mechanically. Sly, obviously, is going to be sneaking around, stealing things, and climbing things. Bentley and Murray are too weak and too clumsy, respectively, to be doing any sort of stuff like that. Instead, Bentley acts as the demolitions expert and field hacker, taking down the enemy infrastructure, be it physically or digitally. Clearly, he's too weak for hand-to-hand combat to be super effective, so instead he'll fire darts with his crossbow that can put enemies to sleep. He can drop or throw bombs at will too, and in some missions he'll even take control of his trusty RC chopper to do the bombing for him. Later he'll unlock an array of crossbow shots and bombs that can shrink enemies or turn them into health, among other things. Murray, meanwhile, does the heavy lifting of the group, literally. When he's not fighting off waves of enemies, he's carrying stuff that his buddies can't, like a giant priceless gem or an actual bear. Murray's a total tank in combat, punching, throwing, and thunderflopping onto his foes. By buying stuff on ThiefNet, Murray can unlock abilities to scare everybody away just by screaming, or he can just light his fists on fire and instantly disintegrate anything he punches. Although players control Sly for about 60% of the game, these two play a vital role in each episode. See, while Sly 1 focused on individual missions that would lead to the eventual showdown, 2 really drives home the idea that these missions are the setup for a greater job. We're not just earning keys that we need in order to progress, essentially every mission in 2 is one piece of the puzzle, no matter how crazy it may sound. If Bentley says this water tower is a giant robot, you better believe him. And each of these episodes culminates in a big attempted heist, with the entire gang coming together and executing their own tasks. Swapping between Sly, Bentley, and Murray and seeing the synergy feels so satisfying in these levels. The payoff for the past hour or 2 of work is more than worth it when you know that every single bit that you did had an impact. It was a risk for Sucker Punch to expand the scale by this much this quickly, but it was absolutely worth it. Naturally, this episode structure does come with some repetition. You're going to do reconnaissance in every chapter, you're likely going to follow and or bug your target, and you're going to follow Neela around a handful of times too, usually for her to show you an important secret that'll help you in the heist.
Don't fall behind while I lead you to the entrance.
Yeah, I get it. Don't fall behind, keep up, the usual. Neela, you gotta move out of the way. Neela, you gotta, come on, get out of the way. Neela, gotta scooch. Neela, there are guards coming. Come on, just scooch a little bit. Just get out of the way. Neela, just move out of the... You know what? I'm just gonna start the mission over. Probably be a lot better that way. Oh, come on! What? I didn't even hit her! However, despite having some greatest hits mission tropes that pop back up both here and in the sequels, Sly 2's mission design never starts to slack. If it's an old concept, you'll be doing it in a novel way, and often these missions are practically brand new even if they do fall into the categories of steal stuff or break stuff. The only missions I don't really care for tend to be the turret missions, because they're on the easy side but the controls are still kind of stiff. Like my other gripes with the gameplay, this is a very minor nitpick. While we're talking about gripes, let's just get them all out of the way because they tend to go hand in hand. When you select the Abandon Job option during a mission, it boots you right back to the safe house. The main reason I want to abandon a job is that I just started that mission and found a treasure sitting around that I want to return, so booting me back to the safe house is just tedious. This sucks because you can't actually return treasure to the safe house during a mission at all, as in order to deliver treasure you have to enter the safe house, which also abandons the job by default. And when you're in the safe house, there's no indicator of which member of the gang has an active mission, so sometimes you have to exit with a character just to find out, only to re-enter the safe house and change characters again. And lastly, Bentley and Murray very infrequently feel like the overworlds just aren't designed well enough for them. It's very rare, maybe only once or twice each, but sometimes you need to go out of your way with these characters in order to reach an elevated area, since they can't climb like Sly can. This issue is mitigated later on by Murray's turnbuckle jump and Bentley's Hackpack, but Bentley's in particular comes pretty late in the game, so it's a bit moot by then. The same goes for their inability to pickpocket. That sort of leaves Sly as the only one who can get loot and reliably farm for coins. Do all of these things kind of suck? Yeah, in my opinion they do. Do they take away from the game's magic? Absolutely not. I don't hesitate one bit to call Band of Thieves a masterclass in design. The mission progression is spot on. The gadget and power-up progression is paced nearly perfectly, with only a little bit of loot grinding at the very end if you decide you want every power. Each character feels unique while also feeling like a member of a team. Hell, not just a team, a family. All three of them have at least one boss fight and several moments to shine. This is what I really wanted out of this series. Yet again, one or two small stumbles don't detract from one of the best PlayStation 2 games of all time. Band of Thieves earns another Golden Bolt. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. The Sly franchise does a fantastic job of feeling like a playable cartoon. Everything from the episodic nature of the story, to the short missions that keep your attention without dragging on for too long, matches this goal, and makes sure that kids remember the Cooper gang long after they're done with the game. Sly 2 takes this a step further, turning the pause screen into a "we'll be right back" screen, allowing the player to decide when the commercials are in this adventure. The comic-style intros and outros are back and better than ever too, this time complemented by more in-game cutscenes as well as Bentley's slideshow scenes. Both of these set different tones and allow the game to convey a far wider range of emotions than the first game. Sly chatting with Carmelita before a ballroom dance brings back that will they won't they romance while also keeping the player a bit on edge. What happens if Sly blows his cover, or if Murray drops the clockwork wings during the dance? It's great stuff.
Cooper!
Oh. Yeah, okay, it's not all great. Carmelita has a new voice actress, and she is, not good. She just sounds so forced. I would argue it's somehow a step down from Sly 1. What's even worse is the same voice actress performs as Neela in this very game, and it's miles ahead of her Carmelita. Thankfully, the rest of the voice cast returns for the main characters, and the new villains fit right in with them. Actually, each of the Cooper gang improves immensely from the first outing as well. Sly comes off as more experienced. Bentley starts off super jumpy as it's his first time in the field, but over time really comes out of his shell. And Murray's new persona as the Murray is exactly what he needed. Another wonderful touch is that in these short 2 years since Sly 1, we see the gang age thanks to some improved character models. In the first game, Sly in particular had these more pronounced, thinner, and childish features and these massive eyes. That fit his character, of course, he was still young and inexperienced. Since Sly 2 moves into a deeper direction, so does our hero himself, with a much more subtle and much more mature facial structure. This is most apparent in the Binoculcom scenes, and once you see each character's new model, it's a tiny bit jarring to go back. So much of the rest of the game takes that leap forward visually as well. Enemies look more menacing, and there are more of them. Each Claw Gang member has at least 3 different types of henchmen, each of which has its own feel, both in and out of combat. Hell, I mean, Rajan has actual elephants roaming around, which raises the question, why are there regular animals in a world dominated by anthropomorphic animals? That gets even darker when you see this mounted moose head in Jean Bisson's cabin. Is that a regular moose, or is that a guard that said the wrong thing in front of the boss? This is giving me the creeps, I'm outta here. Whoa, wait a sec, Mr. Rossetti! Of course, the attempt at going for a grander scale does come with some setbacks. There's a decent amount of pop-in on certain pieces of terrain, for example. Generally, the game's also a bit buggier than Sly 1, as you saw with... yeah, that. They're usually very small bugs that don't affect the game in the slightest, but they're noteworthy regardless. My favorite is when enemies are instantly killed by a high fall, despite the fall only being like 10 feet. It's all in good fun as long as the game doesn't crash, but be warned, there is one specific mission where the game really likes to do just that. I've had 2 separate crashes in this bear cave on the PS3, several years apart, and I very vaguely remember the exact same crash happening to me once on PS2. Thankfully, Sly 2 is very good about its autosave, but having to reset your system entirely is a bit of a minus, I would say. The last thing I'll touch on here is the soundtrack, which is again a massive step up from Sly 1. Each overworld and most of the interiors have their own themes, and rather than settling as background music, these become another character in themselves. Sly 2 introduces the Sly Cooper theme, a piece so iconic that I actually played it in the Sly 1 review, and most of you probably didn't notice because it goes that hand in hand with the series. Essentially, every overworld theme in the entire franchise from here on out adds a reference to the Sly theme. This keeps firmly planted in your mind, no matter what you're doing, that you're playing a Sly game. It might sound like this would get annoying, but it never does, because each theme still does an excellent job of differentiating itself, while still making sure to bring it on home. Band of Thieves almost completes the trifecta. The story is superb, the gameplay is top-notch, and the presentation is right up there too. However, there are a lot of those little bugs and quirks that do add up, even if individually they're not harming the game. Those plus that big crash and Carmelita's amateur hour performance mean that I have to lop at least something off the score here. For its presentation, Band of Thieves will earn a silver bolt. Okay, stop me if you've heard this one before. After the release of its wildly improved PS2 mascot platformer sequel, and with the PlayStation 3's release looming, this growing developer continued firing on all cylinders, working on a title to cap off this trilogy, a third game that was greenlit before the second had finished production, and they only had 11 months to do it. Now, the difference here is that Sucker Punch has always prided itself on being a smaller team, a one-project studio that ensured everybody on staff can go all in and take their time. It's why later down the road, when Sucker Punch pitched its first PS3 title, Infamous, to Sony, the studio management requested a budget that would usually amount to 2 years of production costs, while making clear that it was going to work on a 3-year production cycle. The team chose instead not to ramp up with temporary or new staff hires and deal with crunch, but take their time and work with what they have. The reason I mention Infamous is because it's frankly important here, because Sucker Punch came into Sly 3's development knowing that with this new console right around the corner, they wanted to experiment. This meant that Sly 3 was going to be Sucker Punch's final Sly Cooper game. Despite cutting off a full year from their usual production schedule in order to get out before the PS3, they wanted to end this trilogy with a bang. The question is, did they pull it off, or did Sly 3 try to do too much, too quickly? Unlike the previous games in the series, Sly 3's narrative actually begins at the end of the game. The Cooper gang is working a new heist, attempting to break into the Cooper Vault. This previously unknown vault had been home to the priceless loot of all of Sly's ancestors, and it was time for the gang to claim Sly's birthright. However, it's not just the Cooper gang as we know it from Sly 2. For this job, the gang has added several more members. Apparently, Sly, Bentley, and Murray needed some help. The mysterious Dr. M had already set up shop next to the vault, spending decades attempting to break in, and in doing so had turned the remote island into his own fortress. After the heist goes awry, and after a brief confrontation with Dr. M, one of M's mutant creature things grabs Sly and starts squeezing the life out of him. This is the frame for our story, as Sly's life flashes before his eyes, specifically the last few months of setup for this very job. And with that, we go through those past few months, traveling across the globe yet again as Sly and the gang, albeit this time with a slightly different goal than in the first two games. Rather than taking something back bit by bit, like the Thievius Raccoonus or the Clockwork parts, Sly 3 focuses around building up the gang bit by bit in order to take that something, in this case the vault, back all at once. All the while running from Carmelita, of course. There is no enemy group like the Fiendish Five or the Claw Gang that connects each episode together. These are independent stories. For what it's worth, I like that concept. I don't know that they could have outdone the interweaving story that Sly 2 had, so to move in a totally different direction works for me. Plus, it lets each episode breathe a little bit, as well as each episode's big bad. In order to recruit each new member of the Cooper Gang, we need to earn their trust, or help them complete their own goals first. For example, in the very first episode, Sly and Bentley find Murray in Venice and have to convince him to rejoin the gang. See, after Bentley was paralyzed at the end of Sly 2, Murray blamed himself and he left the gang to find his inner peace. His spiritual mentor, the Guru, ordered him to clean the water of Venice, which had been polluted by the mob boss Don Octavio's tar dumping. Murray absolutely won't rejoin the group until this is fixed, so it's on Sly and Bentley to help their old friend if they want him back. After that, the gang returns to the Outback so that Murray can report his success to the Guru, who also joins up after they rid his homeland of miners. In addition to the Guru, the gang adds 3 new members. Penelope, a remote control vehicle expert and Bentley's new love interest. The returning Dimitri, their frogman for underwater jobs. And the Panda King. You know, the guy who killed Sly's dad right in front of him? Yeah, him. I wasn't really a big fan of this plot point for a long time. Both Sly and the Panda King are at each other's throats initially, but almost immediately after that they're working together without much issue. During this most recent playthrough though, it actually did grow on me quite a bit. We see the Panda King fight with his past demons, and fight the urge to kill the raccoon that ruined his life. We see that the old Panda King is, for the most part, gone, and that right now all he cares about is saving his daughter. While they still do patch up a bit too quickly for my tastes, I started seeing a bit more underlying tension between the two that slowly fades away as they work towards their shared goals. It's a bit sloppily done, but now I kind of like this. I also enjoy how smart the villains are in Sly 3. Well, some of them. Throughout the game's 5 main chapters, we meet some of the strongest villains in the entire franchise, as well as some of the weakest. Don Octavio is another sort of Dimitri, a villain that's quickly thwarted, but whose character is entertaining enough that people still love him to this day. General Tsao and Captain Lefouille each outsmart the Cooper gang on more than one occasion, subverting the player's expectations. Something as simple as Tsao finding the bug that was placed in his base completely throws a wrench in the entire heist structure that Sly 2 introduced, and it's great. Lefouille outsmarts and outstrategizes the gang even during their big end-of-episode heist, proving to be one of the smartest foes that the gang ever encounters. And then there are the villains for episodes 2 and 3. Episode 2's villain is just an evil mask. On one hand, it's hilarious fighting a mask, but on the other hand, this leans a bit too much into the surreal for my tastes. Episode 3's boss, the Black Baron, is... well, it's Penelope. She dressed up because as a child she was denied entry into an illegal aerial dogfighting league. The Black Baron was let in without a problem though, and Penelope was so dominant that she created her own competition that she would win by cheating. Naturally, despite cheating herself, as the Black Baron she bans cheating from any other entrant. But then as Penelope she helps the Cooper gang who are breaking the rules by being out of their hotel at night by defending their hangar from an attack by another cheating team. Look, I like this chapter a lot, but this is pretty weak storytelling when you really think about it. But hey, at least Penelope won't dress up as a mysterious male villain again, right?
I'll kill your dick!
It's time to return to the present, where Sly finishes his reminiscing by realizing that all of these jobs didn't matter to him as much as he had thought. Right now, having seen Bentley and Penelope together, all he wanted to do was be with Carmelita. Oh, hey, good timing. With Sly out cold with a bad concussion, the rest of the gang stages an impromptu assault to take back Sly's cane before Dr. M can get into the vault. When Sly comes to, against Bentley's concerns, he jumps right back into the action. It was his cane and his family's vault after all, he couldn't just sit on the sidelines. After getting into a dogfight with Dr. M's windfish monster, this guy is weird. Sly gets his cane back, and Dr. M reveals that he was the third member of the original Cooper gang, acting as the Bentley to Sly's dad. He claimed that Sly's father took all the glory, all the fame, and all the credit for his team's accomplishments, when none of it would have been possible without his intelligence. He was attempting to take back the treasure that he felt was his right just as much as the Cooper family's. After Sly escapes with his cane, and with his 2 best friends by his side, he opens the Cooper vault and enters. They don't get far before Sly has to continue alone though. Shortly after that, Dr. M enters the vault behind them, revealing that he'd placed a tracking device on the cane so that the Cooper gang could lead him right to the money. Bentley and Murray hold off M's goons to give Sly some time, but M plants the seed in Bentley's head that he should be the leader of the gang, not the much less intelligent Sly. This is a super interesting wrinkle, to have Bentley potentially growing disdain for Sly in the same way that M did for Sly's father, but it's introduced far too late. There are little teases of Bentley being jealous of Sly throughout the game, notably when Penelope has a small crush on everybody's favorite raccoon, but it's never brought together in a meaningful way. As soon as M mentions he was in the old Cooper gang, that's the first we get of Bentley reconsidering his friendship, and almost immediately it's dropped as Murray snaps Bentley out of it. Anyway, after an awesome platforming level that features Sly running through each ancestor's section of the vault, Sly gets to the inner sanctum, with Dr. M not long behind him. The 2 battle with Sly winning out. As the whole vault is falling apart from the fight, Carmelita comes in to bust both Sly and Dr. M. It just wouldn't be a Sly game if Carmelita didn't jump in during the final boss after all. M fires a final shot at Carmelita in an attempt to have the last laugh, but Sly jumps in the way, taking the bullet, and Carmelita takes down M. That concussion catches up to Sly, and he has no memory of who he is due to M's shot. In an interesting twist, Carmelita lies, calling him her partner, Detective Cooper. The two of them escape together, leaving Dr. M to be crushed by the very thing that he had fought for so long to enter. Bentley and the rest of the gang search for any trace of Sly afterwards, but they soon realize that Sly doesn't want to be found. As a gift, he left behind his cane and his gear, holding up a small entrance into the vault. With essentially infinite riches, the rest of the gang splits up and goes about life without Sly. In a double teaser, Bentley later realizes that Sly is faking his amnesia to be with Carmelita, and he also reveals that he and Penelope are working on a time machine, teasing the eventual Sly 4 that Sucker Punch later admitted they explicitly planned to never make. That's where the Sly trilogy would cap off, and it's the last we would see of the raccoon for 8 long years. If there's one word I could use to describe how I feel about Honor Among Thieves, it's conflicted. I enjoy the story they tell here, but the execution pretty consistently feels rushed. The team only had a year to make Sly 3, and it shows both here and elsewhere. After the narrative that Sly 2 brought to the table, the stakes feel far lower here. Without Clockwork looming overhead, the story lost a bit of its direction and urgency, and Sucker Punch went all over the place trying to add new wrinkles to the plot before thinking about how to make those wrinkles matter. I still love the villains, well, for the most part. The dialogue is better than ever, well, for the most part, and they continue in that darker direction that Sly 2 started us on, well, for the most part. Notice that I keep saying, for the most part. Sly 3 is a constant give and take, and it leaves me feeling like that it factor that kept Sly 2 and even Sly 1 feeling so powerful is, for the most part, missing. It's still not bad, but it leaves a lot to be desired. I'll give the story of Honor Among Thieves a silver bolt. Conflicted is going to be a theme on this one. For the most part, Sly 3 doubles down on Sly 2's changes to the formula, while also making tweaks to optimize it for our 3 main characters and fixing almost every minor issue that I had with Band of Thieves. You can actually see in the safe house who has an active job. Thank you! No longer do the worlds feel more made for Sly, because Bentley and Murray both have mobility options from the get-go. Bentley's new wheelchair is tricked out with rocket boosters, eventually letting him perform a triple jump, and Murray can curl up into a ball and bounce higher than anybody else in the game. Both characters can pickpocket now too, and as an added bonus, the loot you pickpocket is instantly sold and added to your coin counter. You'll still spend those coins on ThiefNet to buy new gadgets and power-ups, although almost every gadget is a repeat from the previous games. The main new ones are Murray's Aboriginal Ball Form, which is free from the start, Bentley's Grapple Cam, and Sly's Rocket Boost. Remember how I said I love the Stealth Slide in Sly 2? The Rocket Boost is that, but faster while still being silent. Instead of relying on gravity to do the work, you can slide wherever you want, even uphill, although it does cost a bit more energy to use now. Still, I love it! Sly also obtains several new outfits, which will be used in certain levels to blend in with and sneak past the guards, provided Sly can give those guards the correct passwords. These passwords are just stupid and fun, especially the ones in Venice with Sly's now infamously terrible Italian accent. He definitely doesn't fit in with Octavio's mob. Here, watch this. Hey Sly, what's your favorite mob TV show?
Soprano?
Yep.
While there aren't many new gadgets, Sly does have a series of combo abilities that you can buy to spice up the game's combat. There are 3 powers, each with 3 levels for you to purchase, and they are almost all absolutely useless. You can press triangle once to charge a level 1, twice for a level 2, and thrice for level 3 before pressing X, square, or circle to do a different kind of attack. I went ahead and tested every single one of these out, and the level 2 circle attack does the most damage with the least cooldown. Keep in mind, most of these special attacks will take down regular guards instantly anyway, so they're only really useful against bosses. Also keep in mind that there are only 6 real bosses, and you only fight 3 of them as Sly. The level 3s are mostly redundant and take way too much time to execute to be worth it comparatively. Considering they're each worth up to 1,000 coins, and the best loot you can pickpocket is only worth 150 coins, this is the biggest heist in the entire Sly franchise. And if you're thinking, "Excuse me, Mr. the Golden Bolt, why aren't you just collecting the treasure like you did in Sly 2? Let's talk. Honor Among Thieves removed treasure entirely. It also removed clue bottles entirely. 2 of the main things that made these open worlds as engrossing as they were are gone, replaced with some mostly useless traps that are thrown around the levels. There's no purpose to exploring anymore. Many episodes have whole chunks of land that you don't even need outside of one specific mission. You might now be thinking, well, just run around and pickpocket to get some money while you explore. That'd be great, except the loot scales in value based on the episode you're in. Pickpocketing starts out only earning you 20 to 30 coins. By the time I got to the final world of the game, I decided to grind out 3,000 coins worth of pickpocketing. After spending it all on upgrades, I still had about 15,000 coins worth of upgrades left in the shop. For reference, the total cost of gadgets in Sly 3 is nearly identical to that of Sly 2, only around 24,000 coins. By the final level of this game, I had barely gotten a third of the purchasable upgrades. Even after lowering the prices of the returning items, with how overpriced everything is relative to the coins that Sly 3 gives out, the economy here is pretty much broken. You'll spend most of the game just catching up to where you were at the end of Sly 2. With the background stuff out of the way, how does the core gameplay hold up? For the most part, really well. The episodes aren't nearly as formulaic as they were in 2. Instead, most missions feel totally different from one another, arguably to a fault. Honor Among Thieves drops quite a bit of that stealth pretense that the other games had, instead moving more fully into beat-em-up action territory, and this is a change that I'm not super fond of. There are a few new stealth additions, like these combination locks that take the place of the vaults that are no longer in the game, but in general, less and less often you find the Cooper gang actually sneaking around, and far more often the game focuses on set pieces, moments, and combat. This is most noticeable with the inclusion of the 4 new Cooper gang members. And this is where Sly 3 sort of falls into some Sonic Adventure syndrome for me. There are no fewer than 15 different gameplay styles in Sly 3, and almost none of these get even close to a respectable amount of the spotlight. It gets really cramped when there are only 8 or 9 jobs in each episode and you need to split that among 7 characters. The Cooper gang becomes a full house here. I have an idea. Hey Sly, who's your favorite character in Full House?
Tanner.
They're all named Tanner, Sly. Piling onto that, these characters don't necessarily feel like these expert members of the team that they're chalked up to be. Panda King is a demolitions expert, but all he does is slowly pack his backpack full of fireworks. We've seen Bentley do some really impressive stuff with explosives in the past, why can't he just do some more? We don't even get Panda King's flame foo, only a single sluggish chop. Dimitri is added to the team so late that he's only used twice for underwater missions, and both times he has a slightly different control scheme. The Guru is mainly used to mind control enemies and run them into stuff so that it blows up. Guru, what are you doing? No! And Penelope is a supposed remote control expert, but her remote control chopper is worse than Bentley's. You mean to tell me that this guy, who made his own robotic wheelchair with moving arms, a spring mechanism, and a jetpack, can't make an RC car? I don't buy that. These characters were designed to forward the story and not much else. That's why they're not even selectable in the safe house. Even Sucker Punch knew that there wasn't enough here to justify letting you take the Guru or Panda King out for a stroll. What ends up happening is that in order to accommodate everybody, we have halves of missions thrown together with different characters. You might play as Murray for a bit, and then as Guru for the second bit, for example. This allows for a slightly tighter gang narratively, but again, it comes at the cost of the gameplay, and the narrative isn't really good enough to justify sacrificing said gameplay. You always find yourself doing something new in Honor Among Thieves, and that's not necessarily a bad thing when done in moderation. However, Sly 3 doesn't really have much moderation. This game dives into so many pools without checking to make sure that any of them are deep enough, and it ends up hitting its head on the shallow pool floor so many times that it gets concussed and forgets who it's supposed to be. I always find myself enjoying the variety at the start of the game, but by the time I'm nearing the end of it, I'm just tired of it all. And right around that point is when they introduce the gimmick to end all gimmicks, the pirate ship. Yet again, Sly did it years before Assassin's Creed. The reason the economy is so backloaded in Sly 3 is because the final section of the pirate level puts you in control of an entire ship for naval battles, treasure hunting, and, well, that's it. You'll earn more coins in 10 minutes of naval battles than you ever did pickpocketing. And that's going to sour you on all that pickpocketing you did because you felt like you were behind on power-ups. At the very least, I do enjoy this section for what it is. It's nothing special, but as a kid, I loved it. Plus, it does have more content than Sea of Thieves. If not for me grinding through the pirate section just to max out all of my abilities, Sly 3 would end up clocking in a bit shorter than Band of Thieves, but still decently longer than Sly 1. If you really want to extend your game time, replacing all of the collectibles are the Master Thief challenges, which are mostly just time trials, do the same mission without getting hit, and a treasure hunt for each overworld. They're not really worth your time, but at the very least they use the treasure hunt more than once. Oh, and there's multiplayer, I guess. It's not very good, you'll play it exactly once and then probably never again. I hate that I have to be as negative as I am about Sly 3's gameplay. For every fix it brought to the table, there's at least one shortcoming due to the rushed development cycle. Often there are multiple, and most of them have to do with the game being spread far too thin for its own good. If you're a fan of that Sonic Adventure style of game design, where in my critical opinion the quantity of gameplay styles often trumps the quality and prevalence of each individual style, odds are you'll actually love Sly 3. I get that side, I really do. For me, as a reviewer and as a big fan of these games, Sly 3 is a regression, not just from Sly 2, but in many ways even from the first game. So much so that when I was younger I developed phantom memories of collecting clue bottles in Venice simply because I expected those out of a Sly game. Sly 3 is certainly not a bad game mechanically, but it's to me the weakest Sly game so far. I'll give the gameplay a bronze bolt. I'm gonna keep this part short. If you liked Sly 2's presentation, you'll love Sly 3's. The voice acting, with the occasional exception of Sly himself, is top-notch, more often than not surpassing the previous games. Carmelita, surprise, has a new voice actress, but this time that's a good thing. The new one brings so much more fire here, and that's more than welcome after
Cooper!
The dialogue that these voice actors are being given is also a huge improvement. With no urgent mission at hand, the gang has time for some wittier and often funnier dialogue.
Ever see someone put their fist down their throat?
Some people pay good money for that, pal. There is the occasional audio mixing issue though, where the music just blasts over the voiceover. It's never a big deal since the subtitles in the Sly games are mandatory, but it's a thing that happens. I don't really mind that though, because the music in this game is another huge step up from Sly 2. While I love 2's soundtrack, some of the tracks are more atmospheric affairs. Sly 3 throws the music in your face, and does so confidently. This game knows that its music is great, and it wants to make sure that you know it too. Oddly enough, the game's weakest facet when it comes to the presentation are the visuals. Everything's been improved, the animations, the lighting, it's all top-notch. Each level now has a full introduction cutscene where you'll see the gang making their way across the level to enter the safe house, which I absolutely love. Every episode takes place over multiple days and at different times, which is even better. In the original PS2 version of the game, some missions even allowed you to put on some complimentary red and blue goggles so you could play as the Blue Bandit in 3D. Huh. Blue Bandit? Blue Bomber. Hey Sly, who's your favorite character in Mega Man?
Shut up!
All of this comes at a price, and that price is paid in frames. To be fair, that's the only way you could have paid it. After all, you sure as hell ain't earning coins in Sly 3. The frame rate falls apart constantly, especially on the HD collection. Your mileage may vary, but these frame rates often dipped in similar spots on PS2, just not as badly. The pirate sections in particular are horrendous, and the 3D goggles levels in Australia look pretty rough. It's not a game breaker by any means, but it especially sucks to see a game that looks this good have this many issues. Honor Among Thieves will earn a silver bolt for its presentation. Although on our side as players, 8 long years passed between Sly 3's release and the next Sly Cooper game, behind the scenes things were pretty fascinating. For a long time, the story as we understood it went something like this. Independent developer Sanzaru Games, while working with Sony to develop a PlayStation 2 port of Secret Agent Clank, pitched a Sly Cooper 4 by producing an in-engine recreation of Sly 2's Paris hub world. Sony approved the project, first trusting Sanzaru with an HD collection of the original Sly trilogy on PS3 so that a 4th game would generate more interest, and also presumably because Sanzaru only had one original game under its belt, and, you might as well make sure that they're gonna make it work. Shut up, don't say it yet. However, in the summer of 2021, a member of the Sly Cooper modding community, which yes is a thing that exists, obtained what might be the original pitch for a 4th Sly game, and it wasn't meant for the PlayStation 3, it was intended for the Vita, or the Next Generation Portable as it was known back in 2009. This pitch seems to have been first drafted at the end of 2008 and then tweaked for the subsequent year, and it features a whole slew of darts being thrown at the proverbial wall. The presentation showcased a project called Sly Cooper ThiefNet, which would feature a combination of the Sly gameplay that fans had grown to love with social gameplay features, such as a customizable hideout that other players could attempt to break into and that you could attempt to booby trap so they can't steal from you, and of course loot to steal from one another, and there was potential co-op gameplay, there was touchpad and gyro support, essentially everything you would expect from an early 2011 Vita launch game that uses every gimmick the system had, as well as ambitious pitches for DLC opportunities to try and sweeten the pot for the publisher. A lot of these ideas sound pretty neat. Sanzaru's ideology to target handhelds where platformers were traditionally doing better at the time is a smart one. There's a budget breakdown. It's a neat peek behind the veil that we don't often get to see on our side of the gaming sphere. Later in the same document, it suggests the existence of a Sly Trilogy PS3 upres, which, as we know, did come out as the HD collection, but that came out in 2010. This would be a 2009 pitch, which would mean they either had less than a year to produce all 3 games and port them relatively faithfully, or that was already approved well before this. And it also shows screenshots and even early but close to fully featured gameplay of Sly 4's Japan hub world, which, at least to me, implies that Sanzaru and Sony had several such pitch meetings, or that Sly 4 had already been approved in some capacity prior to this presentation for Sly Vita, whatever that may have been, whether it was a separate game or an addendum to Sly 4, I don't frankly know. You can see so much of Sly 4's DNA already coming out of these prototype clips, for example, its love of motion controls. They felt super out of place when that game released in 2013 as a console-first sort of game, but when you consider that it was supposed to make the Vita's planned 2011 launch date, that changes things quite a bit. It's possible that even this early on, Sony suggested Sly 4 as a cross-buy game for both the PlayStation 3 and the Vita, even though cross-buy didn't end up being publicly revealed until, well after the Vita had already been released and well after it already died. Whatever the case, we have 2 different stories of Sly 4 pitches, and I think they actually might overlap a little bit. This is entirely my speculation here, so please don't source this anywhere, I'm not an authority on this kind of crap, but I would find it completely believable that Sanzaru first created a Paris engine test in 2008 and was greenlit to produce the HD collection, with talks and ideas then ongoing about Sly 4. It's also totally possible that this ThiefNet idea was a companion product independent of Sanzaru's original Sly 4 desires, and that the 2 projects got lumped together and whittled down once they merged. After all, we know that Sly 4 underwent several major and controversial writing changes and other production hurdles due to time, or more likely budget issues earlier on in production, issues that carried throughout the game's entire lifespan, well after it was too late to make any major structural adjustments. Even after a delay from fall 2012 to February 2013 to avoid getting drowned out in a crowded market, it's clear that Sly 4 released in a mildly unfinished state. Then, thanks to middling sales because Sly Cooper was never a big earner, and because late PS3 era Sony management loved to cut its losses and leave studios hanging, Sony dropped plans for the DLC chapter that would have finished the unfinished story. As a very fun bonus fact that's not very fun at all, actually, it's kind of sad, if you go by the original budget projections in this Sly 4 pitch document, its sales today would indicate that the game more than earned a profit. I'm sure that the game's budget did balloon a bit once it was also an HD game on PS3 and not just a handheld, but like I said, wasn't a fun fact, just kind of a sad one. Look, as we'll get into in a second, I think Sly 4 gets a bit of a bad rap. Fans, to this day, vehemently trash-talk Sanzaru, the developers that were so excited to pitch and push to keep this series alive. It's so easy to get angry, call the developers talentless hacks, and then seethe online for 10 years saying the game sucks whenever anybody dares utter its Voldemort name, but as we've discussed in so many of my retrospectives, it's always more complicated than it looks. I mean, don't get me wrong, the game still got more than its fair share of issues, but like so many of Sony's middle-tier games in this late PS3 era, it's more a casualty of cold-footed management, poor timing, and a lack of general interest in the series. Wow, that's a bit of a downer to end this transition on, so let me whiplash you real quick by saying I like this game a lot more than most do. It certainly had a better upside than Sly 3 at least. Yeah, I said it. Roll the thing. 8 long years after the events of Sly 3, we pick right back up where we left off, with Sly still feigning amnesia, Bentley and Penelope still working on a time machine, and Murray causing havoc as a champion demolition derby driver. Penelope has recently disappeared, however, and while searching for her, Bentley discovers that the writings in the Thievius Raccoonus are bit by bit vanishing. Somebody had clearly beaten him to the punch and developed their own time machine, and clearly that was somebody with far more sinister intentions. Bentley decides it's finally time to get the gang back together, and repurposes Murray's van Back to the Future style. The one thing the gang needed to time travel was an artifact from the era to which they were traveling, in this case a samurai sword from feudal Japan. So by now you know the drill. The gang steals the sword from the museum in Paris and escapes. Well, not before Carmelita finds Sly and, brokenhearted that he'd lied to her for a decade, tries to zap him into the next century with her trusty shock pistol. From there, the gang travels through 5 different eras, freeing Sly's ancestors and even working with them to correct the course of history. Each time period has its own big bad from the present, all of whom report to a mastermind that we'll talk about later. No matter who's running the show though, it's clear that each one has a specific focus, destroying the Cooper family history. The villains in Sly 4 are okay. I'd probably as a whole put them as the weakest in the series. None of them ever pose a huge threat in my eyes, and in a few cases they feel redundant. El Jefe feels like a weaker combination of Rajan from Sly 2 and General Tsao from 3. The Black Knight and the Black Baron are both mysterious figures with a strong grasp on technology. The Grizz is for most of his level just a Diet Dimitri, and Ms. Dezibel is just one of Rajan's elephants. Okay, jokes aside, why are some elephants fully sentient and others just regular animals in this universe? Every villain in Sly 4 in some way represents an homage to the original trilogy, and while I respect that, it weakens each of them when I get a feeling of been there, done that. That's not a lasting issue though, as the weaker villains are made up in a couple ways. First off, a more minor addition, the guards in this game have a ton of personality. They're often caught talking in cutscenes, and their dialogue can be hilarious. Much more notably, you'll probably forget about the boss issues due to the newest, or I guess oldest, members of the gang, Sly's ancestors. In each episode, the gang rescues that era's ancestor, and after that, they become fully playable characters with their own missions, dialogue, and most importantly, personalities. Seeing some of these Coopers that we've built up over the course of Sly 1 and 3, such as Ryoichi or the Wild West Bandit Tennessee Kid, in the flesh is an amazing creative decision that blows the gang of Sly 3 out of the water. The main Cooper trio teaming up with one of Sly's ancestors in each episode, with Carmelita later joining the gang as well, albeit hesitantly, makes for a fantastic spin on the group dynamic that helps cut out any concerns about the gang starting to get stale. Not to mention, it's great to see these ancestors interacting with the gang, and hear Bentley try to explain modern technology to them. By the game's 4th episode, with Carmelita and Sly at least somewhat reunited, Bentley's really missing Penelope. Yeah, remember how I mentioned Penelope once and then forgot about her for a little while? So did Sly 4, oops. After working to learn more about the Black Knight, Bentley eventually trails him into one of his facilities, where the night suit opens up to reveal... Penelope. She had betrayed Bentley and joined Le Paradox in wiping out the Cooper line because she had grown tired of Bentley's moral compass interfering with their combined intellect. As arguably the 2 smartest people on Earth, they could have made a killing if Bentley wasn't, in her eyes, infected by Sly's do-good attitude. By removing Sly and thus his influence from the equation entirely, she and Bentley could rule the world. This is the most controversial part of the entire game, and ruined Thieves in Time for many a Sly fan. However, if you really think about it, her logic isn't totally flawed. It skips over some very important context, like how Le Paradox is absolutely going to double-cross her at some point, but after 8 years of living together between Sly's 3 and 4, and 8 years of Bentley sticking to the good side of the fight even after everybody else had moved on, I can sort of see how Penelope snapped. That said, it's still an awful plot point because of how poorly it's set up and revealed. After being mentioned no more than a tiny handful of times before episode 4, her name's thrown back in your face early and often right before the reveal, which makes it feel both out of nowhere and rushed. Anyway, you're probably wondering who that Le Paradox I mentioned a moment ago is. This little skunk is teased throughout the game, but barely seen until near the end. It's only after he's retrieved all of Sly's ancestors' canes, or at least the 5 we saw, kidnapping Carmelita, and a trip to the present that we find out his motivation. It turns out that Le Paradox was also from a long line of thieves, albeit not very good ones since you could smell them coming a mile away. Le Paradox's father had planned to frame Sly's father for stealing the largest diamond in the world. However, the old Cooper gang already had their eye on that diamond, and beat him to the punch, leaving Daddy Paradox to get locked up. Paradox vowed revenge on the entire Cooper family and planned to wipe their name from history. Sly, as recklessly as always, ran ahead to free Carmelita, knowing he was running right into a trap. Hey, deja vu. Bentley this time didn't need his hacking skills to save Sly though, as he had gone back and brought all 5 Cooper ancestors with him to retrieve their canes. After doing so and restoring the correct flow of time, the gang saves Sly and Carmelita from that trap. Paradox, because he's bad at everything, then accidentally smashes the time machine and opens up a rip in space-time, setting the stage for a final battle with Sly as the rest of the gang escaped. And oh god, this is awful. The final battle of this game is a QuickTime event. I know Sly games have always struggled with final boss battles, but this is by far the worst. After this very weak final boss fight, Paradox tricks Sly into saving him, steals his paraglider, and then escapes to get hit by a plane for whatever reason, leaving Sly to get warped out of the present with no way of his friends finding him. For months after this, Bentley, Murray, and Carmelita continued to search wherever and whenever they could, but they turned nothing up. Sly was just gone. If you get the game's Platinum trophy, you'll find in a little post-credits scene that Sly is stuck in ancient Egypt, a tease for the Sly 5 that, as of right now, we've never gotten. I'll admit, I went into this review pretty skeptical, because I remember having many issues during my first playthrough 5 years ago, but I came out pleasantly surprised. I think Thieves in Time's plot holds up much better than Sly 3's did for me. It doesn't come close to Band of Thieves in terms of writing, but despite some missteps, I really enjoyed this game's story. I'll touch on this more in a little bit, but it felt like this was a labor of love. The dialogue is funny, with references all over the place both to previous games and just pop culture in general. Despite being stuck with the time travel gimmick thanks to Sucker Punch's tease ending to the 3rd game, Sanzaru mostly nailed a time-based story. The only real paradox is in the villain's name. As a result though, the plot stumblings are entirely on Sanzaru. I can't give them a pass for the stuff I mentioned in the spoiler section. Plus, there's a whole subplot about Murray feeling unimportant within the gang that's just a total retread of previous games. Despite knocking a rough gimmick out of the park, they somehow tripped on the way to home base. I still enjoyed what we got, and I appreciate a lot of the moment-to-moment storytelling more than the overall plot lets on, but I can't give the story anything more than a silver bolt. I'm happy to say that despite those narrative stumblings, Thieves in Time mechanically is an absolute return to form for the series. And I don't just mean that they picked up where Sly 3 left off. Oh, no, they did one better. They picked up where Sly 2 left off. This means that clue bottles are back, treasure is back, the open worlds mean something again, and they topped that too by modernizing those open worlds with the addition of a mini-map radar and a full map that you can open at any time by pressing the select button. This is something I didn't know I wanted until I was replaying Sly 2 and 3 for their respective reviews. Even as great as Sly 2's world design is with all the set pieces and landmarks, I couldn't help but feel sometimes that a map would help when searching for those missing clue bottles or treasures. But they didn't stop at just fixing up Sly 2. The costumes from Sly 3 return and now serve a functional gameplay purpose. Each one has a distinct gimmick that alters Sly's moveset, from the fireproof samurai armor to firing arrows with a Robin Hood costume. And these, wait for it, tie into those treasures. Each world has a dozen treasures for you to obtain, with 5 of those set aside for the 5 costumes. Some of them even require you to swap between different costumes, and these especially are a load of fun. All of this makes for some great backtracking moments if you choose to go for all the treasures, and it really helps the worlds feel more whole. But wait, I'm gonna blow your mind. You don't have to enter the safe house anymore to deposit treasure. Thank you! That means that you can grab these treasures mid-mission if you'd like, there's nothing stopping you. This was one of my bigger gripes with Sly 2, and I'm happy to say that Sanzaru thought ahead on this one. These treasures aren't worth nearly as much here. The most valuable one in Sly 4 would fit snugly into the 3rd episode in Sly 2. That's okay though, because Sanzaru heard us again. The loot that you pickpocket in Sly 4 has a set value, and that value is actually substantial here, unlike in Sly 3. Again, thank you! Like always, every world has 3 different types of loot, but here they're consistently worth 100, 200, or 500 coins. So they've addressed some of my biggest issues with both Sly 2 and 3 now, both related to the game's economy. So how does the economy hold up in 4 with these changes? Unsurprisingly, incredibly well. After every single job in this game, you're guaranteed to find some new abilities in ThiefNet. These abilities you can buy naturally scale up in cost over time, but are always pretty reasonably priced. There is a bit of a trade-off. Like in Sly 3, many of Thieves in Time's abilities are iterative upgrades to previous powers, but unlike both Sly 2 and Sly 3, many abilities of old are mysteriously absent here. The combat dodge, and even a series staple like the knockout dive, are gone, which leads me to fight far fewer enemies head-on when I'm playing as Sly. While I do love this from a logical standpoint, Sly was never meant to be a powerhouse in combat after all, it does leave me missing those cut abilities. It feels a bit too uniform now that instead of having a gadget grid with multiple different powers, Sly is limited to just his costumes. And Bentley, Murray, and even Carmelita are each limited to 4 cookie-cutter variants to their standard attacks. Giving Murray explosive or electrically charged punches is neat, but it doesn't make up for losing the ability to incinerate enemies instantly with a punch. There are at least a whole new slew of more passive abilities, such as Bentley being able to kick bombs around, Sly having a dive attack when paragliding, and Murray's elbow drops having a shockwave upgrade.
Oh yeah!
Even the clue bottle rewards are more passive affairs here, with powers that increase the pickup range of coins, a bottle radar, or even one that cuts the damage you take in half. Sanzaru had a clear fondness for more passive abilities, and it works just fine, it just leaves me wanting a bit. Now with all that said, how does the core gameplay feel? It's a new team and a new system. Did they get the feel of Sly Cooper right? Yeah, they did. Sly, Bentley, and Murray feel almost identical to their PS2 counterparts, which makes sense since Sanzaru ported the trilogy over before being greenlit to make Thieves in Time. Hell, even Carmelita more or less feels identical to her Sly 3 gameplay, just with slightly remapped controls and arbitrarily having her super jump locked until a late game purchase. They didn't have to relearn anything because the HD collection was their warm-up. So what about those ancestors? How do they feel to play? Well, in a pretty genius move, Sanzaru avoided the same pitfall that Sly 3 fell into by adding variety without adding new gameplay styles. The ancestors play like Sly without his power-ups, but with new abilities of their own. Ryuichi has a much longer ninja spire jump, Salim Al-Kupar can speed up vertical climbs, and Tennessee Kid just has a friggin' gun. Actually, in one of my favorite references in recent gaming history, Tennessee even has a dead shot as if he's straight out of Red Dead Redemption. Additionally, each ancestor has some unique charge and stealth takedown attacks, which are nothing more than window dressing, but it goes a long way to make them feel more unique. The two ancestors whose abilities I have a bit of an issue with are Sir Galeth and Sly's first ancestor, the Proto-Raccoon Bob. Galeth's ability is a much stronger wall hook jump that crashes through any objects above him. Only in Galeth's world does Sly get less air on his wall hook jumps though, so it almost feels like they intentionally weakened Sly in just this level. Likewise, Bob can climb up ice walls, because for some reason Sly can't do that anymore like he could in 2. These two both utilize abilities that Sly has in a way that he couldn't anyway, don't get me wrong. It just feels a bit weird to see his moveset get ignored or actively weakened just to highlight another Cooper. It's a minor thing in the bigger picture though, and each ancestor is used incredibly well despite this one nitpick. With all of that out of the way, there are only a few things left for me to touch on. The mission design and the overworld, and these two actually go hand in hand here. Let's touch on the latter first. With the jump to the PS3, the team had the opportunity to ramp up beyond the smaller, more contained worlds from the previous games, and boy did they do just that. It can be a genuine challenge to find the clue bottles now, because these worlds get pretty huge by Sly standards. To help pack in the worlds a bit more, there are also 60 collectible Sly masks hidden throughout the game. These can be spread throughout the overworlds, but also in the mission-specific areas, and for every 5 or 10 you unlock, you'll also unlock some little goodies that I'll cover a little bit later. However, I can't help but feel the worlds still do end up being a bit on the empty side. It suffers from a much different problem than Sly 3, and that ties into the mission design. See, Thieves in Time loves its interiors. The majority of the game's missions take place inside rather than out in the overworlds. This is actually a very welcome change of pace for me, because it allows the game to veer back into being a platformer just as it veered back into being more of a stealth game. It's a superb mixture of all three of the previous Sly games, and it's something I didn't know I wanted. So many of these interiors actually bring me back to the Sly 1 days of linear level design, where missions highlighted the mechanics in unique ways rather than highlighting the worlds in unique ways. Although in an odd omission, the barrel levels are totally gone now. Yet again, Sanzaru brought back and combined aspects of all three PS2 Sly games, but also made some questionable cuts. Either way, these interiors help the missions feel incredibly different in each world, almost to a fault. I will say that I don't feel as satisfied with the heists in Sly 4 because the game is so focused on individual missions that the overarching episode goal gets a bit lost. When it comes to those individual missions though, one of the things I love most about Thieves in Time is that it solved Sly 3's problems with character representation. In this game, missions are longer than they've ever been before, and in nearly every mission you'll take control of multiple members of the gang working in tandem. Very rarely in Sly 4 did I feel that somebody was cut back just to highlight someone else. Carmelita's a bit underused in Arabia if I want to nitpick, but that's about it really. Bentley's RC car and chopper also make somewhat limited returns, with hacking taking a much more substantial role here. This allows Bentley to sit back in the safe house, letting other members contribute more to the physical jobs while keeping the turtle relevant. In Sly 4, there are 3 different types of hacking minigames: an updated version of the tank minigame that we all know and love, a side-scrolling shoot-'em-up, and the most questionable, ball mazes that are exclusively controlled by the DualShock 3's 6-axis gyroscope. This game came out in 2013. Ratchet & Clank Future Tools of Destruction came out in 2007 with a similar 6-axis minigame, but even back then there was the foresight to turn that crap off. This came out the same year as The Last of Us and is still using launch-era PS3 gimmicks. It's just strange. At the very least, they're not too intrusive, but if your gyroscope doesn't work, or doesn't work well, you probably can't get too far in Sly 4. Anyway, to get back to the topic of mission variety, while the longer missions can get a bit too long every now and then, I rarely noticed because usually I was having a blast. Sly 4 is just fun, and having dedicated mission areas that aren't just in the overworld goes a huge way towards making it so fun. But again, it's a give and take, because these interiors simultaneously hurt the overworld. For as empty as the worlds were in Sly 3, at least the game used them most of the time for missions. In Sly 4, there are so many jobs that start you in the overworld, only to have you walk 30 feet and enter a specialized area for the rest of that job. And this is where I get to talk about the worst part of this entire game. Sly 4's loading screens, I'm not exaggerating one bit, are some of the worst that have ever existed on the PS3. It's a good thing you don't have to enter the safe house when depositing treasure, because you'd be waiting, no joke, a full minute one way. That's 2 minutes of loading every time you change characters. That's a minute of loading every time you enter an interior. That's 15 to 30 seconds of loading just to load a Bentley hacking mission. As far as I can tell, the game makes no attempt whatsoever to load in the background, so when you're watching that cutscene and then have to walk 20 feet to enter that building, yeah, another minute. When your game has worse loading times than Sonic 06, you've got a problem. While we're talking about Sonic 06 issues, the loading screens, and frame rate for that matter, are even worse on the Vita version of Sly 4. I understand it running at 30 frames per second on handheld, that's fine enough, but it's not a stable 30. Even on PS3, the frame rate isn't even close to a stable 60 FPS. It's bad. The overworlds just seem to be too big for this engine to handle. Going bigger and simultaneously using these overworlds less was a very questionable choice. If you can get past the lower resolution and frame rate though, Sly 4 on Vita is a viable option, if only barely. I'd recommend the PS3 version over it any day, but there are some neat bonuses to playing it on the go, including this AR mode that lets the Vita be a second screen for the PS3 version of the game, highlighting the collectibles you've missed so that you can more easily find them. Also, fair warning, the trophy lists are separate on PS3 and Vita, meaning that if you transfer your save file from one platform to another, and you have the platinum like I did, oops. For all of its issues, I would still actually go as far to say that Thieves in Time is a near-perfect mixture of all 3 Sly games that came before it. But perfectly combining three games that were often at odds with one another doesn't lead to a perfect game, it leads to a bit of a perfect mess. For all of its leaps ahead, Sly 4 does, again, trip quite a bit, so it'll get a silver bolt for its gameplay too. I'll be honest, I used to hate the way that Sly 4 looked. Something about the models just seemed off. I'm not sure what I was thinking though, as looking at it now, it feels like the logical next-gen leap for the series. Obviously the frame rate sometimes hurts that, but Sly, Bentley, and Murray look spot on, with Carmelita looking... okay, they kinda went a bit overboard with Carmelita, and it's making me a little bit uncomfortable. Okay, you know what? I stand corrected. The locales in Sly 4, while they occasionally feel a bit redundant with respect to the rest of the series, are all beautiful in their own right, and more importantly, they feel accurate to the time periods in which they're set. Well, except for the dinosaurs in the Ice Age level, that's not even close. Something else I find super neat is that with the exception of the returning cartoon-styled animations and the final boss fight itself, every cutscene in Sly 4 takes place in real time. If you have the Fists of Flame equipped, Murray's fists will be on fire during cutscenes. This is also true for all of the collectible mask bonuses I mentioned earlier. Each of our 4 present-day heroes has an alternate costume unlocked via those Sly masks. Murray's got a wetsuit, Bentley's RoboCop, Carmelita is Catwoman, which is fitting since her 4th new voice actor plays Catwoman in the Arkham games, and Sly's got a skin very similar to the Caped Crusader himself. There's something fitting about sitting on a perch and taking down baddies as Bat Cooper under the cover of night.
Where's Batman?
Sly in particular even has 2 cosmetic paraglider skins, as well as 2 cane skins that have different effects. The first of these is Cole McGrath's amp weapon from Infamous, Sucker Punch's follow-up to Sly, which will add shock damage and a stun effect to any enemies you hit. And second is Ratchet's wrench, which turns all coins in the game into bolts and doubles the coin value. You get both of these a bit too late in the game to need either of them, but hey, it's still neat. Sanzaru packed in a bunch of these sorts of little references too, with Clank and Daxter hidden in the game as treasures, and Clockwork is even hiding in each of the game's worlds, stalking the Cooper ancestors throughout history just as he said he'd done in Sly 1. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that Carmelita has a new voice actor, again, and she's personally my favorite of the 4 she's had. It's not just her though, every character in Thieves in Time sounds absolutely elated to be there. You can tell just how much the voice crew loved and missed the Cooper gang. With all of Sly's jokes and everybody's banter, there's something to be said about how quickly Sly 4 picks right back up where 3 left off. Even after nearly a decade, nobody missed a beat, and arguably every performance here is stronger than ever. They even brought back Sly's terrible Italian accent. That's dedication. Now, given, the characters might talk a little bit too much when walking around during missions, but I don't really mind that. I wish their mouths moved in-game like they do during cutscenes more than anything. One specific battle has a lot of talking and absolutely zero lip-syncing, it's just distracting. That aside though, there are so many little quirks that show how much Sanzaru truly wanted to make Thieves in Time. For one, they brought back Peter McConnell, the composer from Sly 2 and 3, and he does a great job sliding right back into the role. Sly 4's soundtrack catches right up to, and at many times surpasses, the previous games. Rather than just incorporating that one signature Sly flourish to all of the songs, McConnell sneaks in different sections of the main Sly theme in order to spice it up. Perhaps the instrument choice gets a bit too overzealous during certain tracks, but the overworld themes especially are as strong as ever. Sanzaru really did go above and beyond with little touches. Murray's got a little guru keychain hiding in his binocucom. The treasures are very often callbacks to previous games or to pop culture in general. When you jump into a pit or into water, the game actually rewinds time to reset you back to where you were. They even went as far as to give Sly alternate HUD icons whenever he changes into a different costume. It's something nobody would have missed if it wasn't here, but they wanted to go that extra step. Now, obviously, I probably would have preferred if they'd spent that time optimizing the game a bit more, because again, that frame rate. It's very hard to appreciate Sly 4 as much as I would like to when I'm sitting there in silence during a loading screen or when the game runs like total trash. It's unprecedented that I would mention something like the frame rate negatively affecting 2 different categories in a review, but the frame rate and the loading times here are genuinely that bad that they hurt the game twice. So with that in mind, let's make it a threefer. Sly 4 will again receive a silver bolt, this time for its presentation. Let me tell you, I certainly didn't expect this video to go nearly 30 minutes. I thought, if anything, that the Sly 4 review would be the shortest game in the marathon. But as I was writing the script for this video, it all sort of came together in my head. I saw the pieces of Sly 1, 2, and 3 come together in Thieves in Time, and it made for a much more impactful experience than I was expecting. With all that said, I can't help but feel there is one very big thing missing from Sly 4, but I can't put my finger on it. Wait, I know. Yeah, I couldn't just end it there this time. There's one more Sly game left to cover. Bentley's Hackpack released alongside Sly 4, a $3 collection of bonus hacking minigames that Sanzaru put together while sitting on their hands, since the already delayed Thieves in Time was finished and ready for release months prior. It's a harmless little addition, maybe one last-ditch attempt by Sanzaru at showing Sony that Thieves in Time could still work with that post-launch DLC support. Of course, they were trying to convince a company that had already internally planned for 2 full years of DLC support for its Smash Bros. Game, only to pull out of that Smash Bros. Game within 2 months after better-than-expected sales of that game because sales in Europe specifically weren't good enough. Look, I'm gonna be real with you, Sly 4 was dead before it released, just like contemporaries such as Starhawk, the PS3's Twisted Metal game, PlayStation All-Stars, and so many more, thanks to the PlayStation upper brass's pathetic cut-bait practices. The best we got out of the deal was a pretty solid game that didn't live up to fans' nostalgic expectations, and a rock concert if you spend $3 and do everything in Bentley's Hackpack. So where does that leave us with Sly now? Well, at the risk of dating myself, for now, we'll keep hearing swirling rumors of a reboot or a new game or the TV show, but it's hard for me to say in confidence that the Cooper gang as we know them have a future unless they draw in a completely new, younger audience, the kind that we were when Sucker Punch first captured us in this excellent world. But the trade-off there is that that sort of game probably wouldn't be for us anymore, and that's okay too, that's part of growing up. I'll still hold this series as one of the PS2's very best. Pound for pound, I'll put Sly 2 up there against almost any title on that console, period. If Sly 4 had been able to release a year or two sooner according to its original plan, even if nothing else changed, I think we would have looked at the game a good bit differently. Hell, I think if more folks just went back to it now that some time has passed, they'd probably be a lot less negative too, but again, that's just kind of life. Regardless of wherever the future might take it, Sly's influence is still felt to this day in Sucker Punch's games. Features like the mid-air auto-steering and apparently even the code for Sly's tail animations are still used in games like Infamous and Ghost of Tsushima to this day to simulate things like fabric waving in the wind. It's thanks to Sucker Punch using the anthropomorphic comic Usagi Yojimbo as an influence while working on Sly that the idea of a wandering samurai video game kept popping back into Nate Fox's mind in the first place. Now, do I think that Sucker Punch will come back to the Sly Cooper franchise? No. Have you seen Ghost of Tsushima sales? I really genuinely doubt it. But that said, longtime employees have expressed their love for the Cooper gang even if they have moved on just as a matter of pragmatism. Hell, it sounds like the studio liked Sanzaru's work on Sly 4 more than the fans did. But the breathtaking thing about Sly is that its soul takes after Sucker Punch's just as its soul continues to influence the studio's games. Sly and his friends, just like the studio, pride themselves on sticking best as a small, tightly knit team, a family, and weathering whatever challenges may come their way. That's true for the fanbase as well. There are teams making emulation-based New Game Plus mods with difficulty modifiers, these multi-year, multi-person projects, a level of dedication that you just don't see with many PS2 contemporaries. There are countless fan scripts and pitches out there for a Sly 5, or in some cases a different Sly 4. Some people really don't like that game. Sly's audience may not be massive, it might not be grand, but it's loud as all hell, and it's passionate as all hell. Clearly, somebody at Sony's upper brass, their mistakes aside, recognizes that passion because the company kept pushing towards trying to find a home for the series after low sales, time and again, with artificial discounts, with the movie, with the show, with cross-promotion, Toonami ads, everything. All that's needed to break through to whatever Sly's next level may be is to find a way to get this Cooper gang in front of more eyeballs at the right time. Because it is clear as day that if you give this band of thieves a shot, they're gonna find a way. to steal your heart. Thank you so much for joining me on this revisit through the Sly Cooper franchise. It was a really fun trip down memory lane, and I'm honestly kinda surprised my old voiceover wasn't as bad as I thought it'd be. Hopefully you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed compiling everything together, and make sure to let me know in the comments what you think about the whole series, your favorite game, how much you probably hate Sly 4, all of it, I'm here for it. I'd like to give a quick shout out to the band Consinity for their cover of E.T. used throughout both the original Sly videos and these versions here. Back in 2018, they told me their guitarist was a big fan of the channel and gave me free reign to use some of their tracks. Small world. And speaking of fans of the channel, if you enjoyed what you watched, please make sure you're subscribed to the Golden Bolt so that you can catch all these videos right when they drop. I think something like 75% of the folks that tuned in last month weren't subscribed. If even another 10% did subscribe, I could probably ask Sony to make another Sly game. No promises though. And last but absolutely not least, I want to thank my incredible patrons for their support. You folks are the best. Once again, thank you so much for tuning in, and until next time, stay golden.